All right, welcome everyone to the Science at Home series, hosted by Series Education and Outreach at the University of Colorado Boulder. Today we have our presenter, Dr. Julio Sepúlveda, and he's planning to weave elements of chemistry, biology, history, and paleoclimatology into his presentation today. Julio is an earth scientist who studies the coevolution of life and climate over geological timescales all the way until today. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be here today. Hi, everyone. Julio Sepúlveda, as Megan mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'm an earth scientist, and within the many subdisciplines of the earth sciences, I'm a biogeochemist. I know that's a big word, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, you're going to have a much better idea of what this is all about. So today I'm going to be talking about what we can actually do with fossil molecules. This is a concept that's probably a little bit new to you. And we're going to be learning about how we can use fossil molecules preserved in the geologic record to study Earth history and climate and biology. And particularly, I'm going to give you one example of what we can learn from the time when dinosaurs became extinct. So some of the key questions and concepts that we're going to learn today are, the first question is, how can we study Earth history? I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the work that some of us do. And one of the key concepts, and we're going to talk about marine mud and chemical fossils. And the next question that we're going to try to address is what happened to marine life when dinosaurs became extinct? So I would love to start with a question to you all. And this question deals with how old our planet is. So can you see this Menticom, a Mentimeter? I guess you need to type the code that it's showing up on the screen. So the question we have in front of us here is, how old is our planet? And we have several options. The first option is 4,600 million years. So that is basically 4.6 billion years. 460 million years old, 4.6 million years, or 4,600 years. I don't know if people can see this. Do you know, Megan, if this is active and if it's working? There you go. I see people participating. Fantastic. So options are 4.6 billion years old, 460 million years, 4.6 million years, or 4,600 years. How old is our planet? I'm going to give it 20 more seconds. I only have 4 people so far. I would love to see a few more people participating. So if you see the code on the screen, please use it and enter your answer.
And the code is also available to you in the chat box.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to move on. So we can see that most people here selected 4.6 billion years old. So let's go back to our presentation. And that is indeed correct. If you can look at the base of this diagram here, our planet is around 4.6 billion years old. So this is really a long time. And this cartoon also shows you that we can basically divide the history of a planet into different intervals. And you know, there are different names: the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic here, Paleozoic. We have times where dinosaurs were around, times before the dinosaurs where little smaller creatures were roaming around the world, and all the way until the present. We are right here on top of this column called the Holocene. And something that this very simple cartoon is indicating is we can basically study the layers of our planet as preserved in the geologic record, and we can learn something about who was living back in the day and how the environments that these organisms live in look like. So if there is something that we can tell from the geological record is that our planet was very different in the past than how it is today. So in this figure, we have two maps of the world. The top one is showing the world as it looks like today, and the bottom one shows how the planet looked like 90 million years ago during the time called the Cretaceous. And you can see that there are many differences. Some of the most obvious ones are that the location of continents and the ocean basins was very different than today. For instance, we see that South America and Africa were much closer to each other back then than they are today. Therefore, the Atlantic basin was a lot smaller than it is today. You can see that many parts of the continents were underwater. That's because there was a lot more water in the ocean back in the day than there is today. And the reason for that is because of this. So if you look at the present, we see that the high latitude, so the Arctic region and Antarctica, are covered by ice. So there is a gigantic ice sheet here in the southern hemisphere over Antarctica, and a big one here over Greenland. And there are some remnants of other ice sheets here in the northern hemisphere. So back in the day, 90 million years ago, our planet was a lot warmer than today because we had a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere than we have today because of natural causes such as volcanism. And that caused that a lot of this ice melted and ended in the ocean. So that's why the sea level was much higher. Many parts of the continents were underwater. So, and it's really interesting because if you look at some of the fossils that you can find around the Arctic for this time period, we see that there were crocodiles, palm trees in these parts of the northern hemisphere compared to today, where we know that it's very cold, and we see this person here holding this picture of how some of these regions in the northern hemisphere might have looked like 90 million years ago. So our planet was very different. So I'm going to introduce something called climate archives, and I'm going to ask a question for this. So which one of the examples that I have in front of you is a good example of our climate archive? Tree rings, ice cores, marine sediment cores, the rock record, or all of the above? If you are not familiar with some of these, I'm going to explain them in a sec. So which one of the pictures that we have here, tree rings, ice cores, marine sediments, or the rock record, are good examples of what we call a climate archive? Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to move on. We have a couple of responses indicating that all of them. And that is indeed correct. So we can basically, climate archive is any natural material in our planet that preserves information about the climate of the past. So in this case, we have tree rings that, they grow every year. Ice cores, if you've never seen an ice core, this is basically like a cylinder that people can drill from ice on Antarctica or Greenland. Sediment cores, these are basically pipes that we can drop to the bottom of the ocean or a lake, and we can recover the layers of mud at the bottom, and we can study those layers, or the rock layers on land showing the rock record. And what is really important about all of these climate archives is that they can give us information of different time scales. So tree rings, we can count them, and we can go anywhere between years to centuries and millennia. Ice cores can talk about years to hundreds of thousands of years of history. Sediment cores, years to millions of years, and the rock record can actually talk about millions to billions of years. And there's a second concept that I would like to introduce today, is climate proxies. So the question that I have here is which one of the examples that I have below are good examples of climate proxies? Fossils in the rock record, air bubbles in ice cores, the rings of tree rings in a tree trunk, or the chemistry of the sediment. And here I have a picture of a cell membrane from organisms. Or do you think that all of them can be good examples for a climate proxy? Please tell me what you think. Okay, so we only have a couple of people. So one of them selected rings in a tree trunk, and the other person selected all of them. And another person selected all of them. Excellent. So we have more people showing now that all of the options are possible. And that is indeed correct. When we look at tree rings, we can count the layers. Each one of the rings, we can look at their thickness, the density, and that tells us something about the environment in which these trees were living, whether it was dry or more humid or cold or warm. Ice cores preserve these beautiful bubbles that have air trapped from back in time, so we can study the chemistry of the atmosphere in the past. Sediments contain little fossils from little creatures that live in the water, in the ocean, or in lakes. We can also study the chemistry of the sediments, and we can basically reconstruct the environments in the past. And of course, the rock record, which is the one that we are more familiar with, we have fossils, and we can also study the chemistry of the rocks to understand how things have changed in the past. So today I'm going to talk about some of my favorite archives, and that is Sediment Course. So Sediment Course from the bottom of the ocean had been extremely important for many decades now for Earth scientists like myself to study the climate of the past. So there are some drilling ships out there in the ocean. One of them is called the Geodis Resolution. It's part of the Ocean Drilling International Program that's been going on for many decades with scientists from all around the world. Basically, this ship has a special device that can put these pipes at the bottom of the ocean, and it can drill the different layers of sediment that accumulates at the bottom of the ocean year after year for thousands or hundreds of thousands of millions of years. So if we look at a core that is recovered from the bottom of the ocean, the deeper we go, the farther back in time we go. It's basically like reading a history book. And once this cores are brought up to the ship again, scientists can cut them open, split them open, cut them in half, and they can describe them, they can take pictures, and they can take little samples that then we can study in the lab. This has been done for so long that this map of the world shows all locations where some holes had been made recovering sediments of different ages to study the climate of the past. And what scientists do, they collect these samples, they clean them in the lab, they sieve them to recover little fossils that they can study under a microscope, and they can study life in the ocean. What about the chemicals? And this is actually what I do as a biogeochemist. So I'm going to introduce to you the biomarker concept. So in this case, we have on the left-hand side here a T-Rex, and what paleontologists do is they look for the remains of these organisms. We have the skeleton of a T-Rex here, and even though a lot of the soft tissues, the skin and the muscles are gone, there's a lot of information preserved in the skeleton for us to tell that this organism was an active predator. It was, feeding on other organisms. It has sharp teeth and claws, and it was pretty long legs. It was probably actively running behind prey. People looking at microfossils, this is an example of an organism called planktonic foraminifera. These are little shells of unicellular organisms living at the surface of the ocean. These are like little, that produces little shells made out of calcium carbonate. So when these organisms die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean, and these fossils get preserved. I look at the chemical signatures. I look at fats that all forms of life on Earth produce. In this case, we have one fat that looks very much like cholesterol that all of us have in our bodies, but it's produced by an organism called dinoflagellate that has nothing to do with dinosaurs, but actually with this little type of algae that are responsible for red tides and brown tides in the ocean. And when these organisms die, the chemicals get preserved in the bottom of the ocean, and even though they suffer some changes through time, the basic skeleton tells us something about the original organism. So if paleontologists can look at the little remains of fossils in the sediment that once lived in the ocean, people like me, we can also look at the chemical signatures that are preserved in the layers of sediment, and we can reconstruct the evolution of life over geological timescales. So this is a timescale showing the last 550 million years of history, and it shows these lines here show the evolution of these three main groups of phytoplankton or microalgae in the ocean: nanoplankton, dinoflagellates, and diatoms. And they tell us one story about how organisms evolve and suffer from extinction and so on. But when we look at the chemical signatures, they actually show us that some of these organisms go farther back in time compared to what the fossil record tells us. because this is very important, because not all of the organisms that live at the surface of the ocean produce hard fossil skeletons that get preserved in the sediment. So if we really want to study how ecosystems change over time, we need to combine the fossil record from the microfossils and the chemical signatures in order to get a more comprehensive overview of how ecosystems change in time. So I see that we're kind of maybe running out of time, Megan, or can I add a couple extra minutes?
Oh, I think it'd be okay if you talk for another couple minutes.
Okay, this is just 2 slides. So I'm going to briefly talk about one example that I'm very excited to show you. I'm going to talk about the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event. This is basically 66 million years ago when dinosaurs became extinct due to the impact of an asteroid that impacted our planet, as you can see here. This was also a time of very intense volcanism, but there is no question today that the asteroid impact was the main cause of the extinction. And if we are able to look at some of the sediments from the bottom of the ocean, and if we look here, this is the boundary when the dinosaurs became extinct. So everything here is before the impact, everything above is after the impact. This is about 500,000 years of sediment history and 500,000 years of history here above. And we see that these lines are showing those organisms that existed before the impact, and many of them disappear here at the boundary. So many of these organisms that produce calcium carbonate skeletons died at the boundary. Some new organisms appear at the very beginning after the impact, and some others appear later. And if we look at the chemistry of the sediments, especially that preserving the carbon, we know that there are big changes in the chemistry of the carbon that is preserved in these sediments. And one of the questions that has remained for a long time is whether this change in the chemistry of the ocean and the carbon preserved in these sediments has anything to do with a decrease in photosynthesis. So I'm going to show you just a couple of examples. This is a drilling that we did on land in Tunisia in Northern Africa, but we were drilling through layers of rock that once were sediments at the bottom of the ocean. And this is called the Al-Kef Coring project. And when we look at this now here on this y-axis, we have meters of core. So we have from 28 meters down to 78 meters, 50 meters of cores. Here we have these chemical signatures in carbon that people have reconstructed in the past. And here we have the signals of different groups of algae, red algae, pelagophyte. These are different groups of phytoplankton living in the ocean. We see that right here at the boundary where I showed my cursor between the green and red, we see that some organisms decrease in their abundance but recover relatively quickly. Some of them suffered a decrease at the boundary and never really recover within the time span of this record. But other organisms did very well, like these guys, the dinoflagellates that I showed you before. Their molecular signals really increase at the boundary. And this is really beautiful because this increase that we see at the boundary matches the fossil record. So this is a really nice example of how the fossil record with the molecular record give us a really nice overview of how organisms respond to environmental change. So what have we learned so far? Yes, marine algae without fossil skeletons were also negatively affected by the impact of an asteroid, but they seem to have recovered much faster than other groups of plankton. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will talk about those. While we're waiting for those, I'll just start out. What would you say was one of the reasons that you got interested in this area of research?
Yeah, great question. So I've been always interested in reconstructing how life has responded to massive perturbations in Earth history. And the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary is a really interesting time in history of our planet because it happened so rapidly. I mean, the impact of the asteroid happened in one day, from 1 minute to another. And even though, the kinds of environmental change that took place after this impact are still debated, some of them are analog to what we're expecting to see in the future, particularly, change in the pH of the ocean. This is a time when we know that the pH of the ocean decreased, so it became more acidic. And this is what we're now causing to the ocean today as we keep adding CO2 to the atmosphere. A lot of that carbon dioxide ends in the ocean, and that is altering water chemistry. So it is a time that allows us to understand how marine ecosystems can rebound from a massive perturbation of the climate system over time scales that might be relevant for the near future.
Great, thank you. So we have another question. This person, first of all, they wanted to let you know that your talk is fascinating, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
But also they wanted to know, as a scientist whose research is so closely tied to climate and environmental change, how do you handle climate change deniers?
Yeah, excellent question. As an educator, as a instructor, professor, the main tool that I use is try to educate people. And I try to educate people with facts. When it comes to climate change, one of the things that we need to stop saying is like, or asking people is, do you believe in climate change? And we need to start asking, do you accept the facts about climate change? So, when you believe in something, you believe that your team is going to win on Sunday. You believe that the weather is going to be rainy tomorrow, stuff like that. But when we talk about climate change, it's not really about believing or not. It's about accepting the facts. And the facts are so clear and so obvious. The entire scientific community around the world has demonstrated by compiling all the evidence that exists that what we're experiencing today is real, it's happening now, and is mostly human caused. Our planet has gone through many cycles of climate variability in the past, many. It's been much warmer than today in the past, as the time that I just explained earlier, the Cretaceous. However, we know the physics. We know how our climate system changes and why. And we know that what's happening now is unprecedented in the history of our planet. We are altering our climate system so rapidly that to the point that there's no point in time in the history of our planet, except perhaps for the impact of an asteroid, which is very dramatic, where our climate changed so fast. So I hope I answered your question well, but stick to the facts.
Thank you. So we also have a question coming in that says, my 5-year-old watched your presentation. He would like for you to expand on the KT boundary.
I see. Sorry, if I can expand on the KPG boundary, on what respect?
Let me just give them a moment to reply.
But
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say.
I can say a few things more,
sure.
just while we wait. So the KPG boundary, it's a really interesting time because, it has fascinated people for so long because of dinosaurs, which is, of course, very appealing. But it's also really interesting, as I mentioned earlier, to use this time interval as an analog to how marine ecosystems, or in general, all ecosystems around the world and our climate system can respond to these very dramatic perturbations of our climate system. As a matter of fact, some colleagues of mine had been studying this event as an analog of what it could potentially happen if we at some point had a nuclear war in the world, which hopefully will never happen in the history of humanity. But given the amount of energy that was released to the atmosphere because of the impact and the amount of material that was ejected to the atmosphere as a consequence of the impact, people have been using this impact as an analog to how the climate could respond to a nuclear war. But for what refers to my work, I've been just fascinated by understanding how those organisms that don't produce any hard fossil skeletons how they responded to this massive perturbation of the climate system, because most of what we know comes from the microfossil record. So these tiny creatures that leave little fossils behind. But when we start looking at the chemical signatures of microorganisms, then we can produce a much more comprehensive and holistic view of marine ecosystems around this time.
Thank you. Another question we have is, how is this how the history of the Earth has been evolutionary. How does that relate?
Let me see if I understand the question correctly. So, how the history of our planet has been evolutionary, or how evolution relates to the history of our planet, perhaps?
I think so. I wasn't quite clear on the question. But...
No, that's an excellent. If I'm understanding correctly, so life would have not been the way it is today if it wasn't because of the impact of an asteroid. So the fact that so many organisms died when this asteroid impacted our planet, that was a significant disruption in the evolution of life on Earth. And as disruptive as it was, it will actually allow other organisms to evolve. So for instance, mammals were not an important group when dinosaurs were around. They were present, but they were tiny. They were mostly hiding from big predators. But when dinosaurs disappeared, that basically left an empty niche for mammals to evolve. So certainly the evolution of mammals would have not been the same without this impact. And we know that this is just one of the many mass extinctions that our planet has experienced. During the last 550 million years of the history of our planet, there has been at least 5 what we call the big 5 mass extinction events that were associated with significant losses of diversity. But there have been other time intervals in the history of our planet when our climate system also changed very dramatically, to the point that many organisms were affected, but not enough to cause mass extinction. And all of these events have played an important role in shaping life on our planet. So there's a very close relationship between climate, evolution of our planet, and how life has evolved at the surface of our planet. Also importantly, life has shaped our climate and as well. You know, when our planet became oxygenated, so when oxygen became a dominant or an important gas in the atmosphere, that mostly happened because of life and the oxygen that photosynthesizers were able to produce.
Thank you. Someone asks, what's the difference between climate change and global warming?
Yeah, good question. So global warming, as the word says, only refers to the aspect that our planet is becoming warmer. And it is a term that, you know, some people don't like much. And the fact that it's only focusing on one aspect of our climate change, of our climate system. Climate change is another one, but our climate changes over time in general. I like to speak more about global change because the fact that our climate system is being altered by our actions, mostly by the dumping of CO2 into the atmosphere as a powerful greenhouse gas that is creating, you know, an enhanced greenhouse effect. So the surface of our planet is warming up faster. But this is leading not just to a warming of our planet, it's also leading to a series of changes in our Earth system. So all the components of our Earth system, you know, the ocean, the cryosphere, the geosphere, the biosphere, that are interacting with each other. And these modifications in our Earth system are basically leading to what we call feedback mechanisms, where, you know, when you it's like a domino effect. You know, if you start something, changing something, you know, that can lead to another change that will potentially amplify the original warming. One good example is like, as the temperature of our planet increases, we are losing more and more ice in certain parts of the world and high latitudes. And as the ice is retreating, we are changing the reflectance of the surface of our planet. So a white surface with ice or snow will reflect a lot of sunlight back to space. But if we remove the ice, we have now bare land or potentially plants populating, and that surface now becomes very dark. And when you change that, you basically, a dark surface would absorb a lot more heat, and that would basically act as an amplifier of the original warming. So the Arctic, for instance, is the area of the world today that is warming up the fastest. And that is because of these positive feedback mechanisms that are amplifying the warming of our planet.
Thank you. And a couple more questions. How long have dinosaurs been extinct, and how do we know the age of fossils?
Oh, excellent question. So when it comes to dinosaurs, I mean, the extinction took place around 66 million years ago. There are several ways that scientists can tell the age of a fossil or a particular Earth layer in the geologic record. For instance, what we call radioisotopes. So, for instance, carbon-14. So, elements have different isotopes. So, for instance, carbon has three different isotopes: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. This is the same element, but with different masses. So, one is a little bit lighter than the other. And C14 is one of those that we call is unstable. It decays over time, and it decays at a certain rate. So we can actually estimate the age of a material by measuring how much carbon is present and knowing how fast this carbon decays over time. Now, radiocarbon has a limitation, and depending on what technique you use, it's roughly anywhere between 50 to 60,000 years only. So it's certainly not a good isotope system for us to study up to date when dinosaurs were around. So, but there are other isotope series that people can study. And there are many colleagues that are actually using different isotopic series of the decay of different elements and turning into a different daughter element that we used for dating rocks. And some of them are more appropriate for timescales of tens of millions of years or hundreds of millions of years, and some of them are more appropriate for even longer timescales. And then we have relative ways of dating. When we know the age of a particular rock layer, then we can look at the fossils and we can compare the fossils present in one section versus another to make connections between different time periods.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sepúlveda, excuse me. And I just wanted to thank everyone. I know there were a few more questions we didn't quite get to, but we'll be able to answer those later after the talk. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and also thank Dr. Sepúlveda.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.